One of the most influential modern horror films, 1980's surprise hit from producer-director Sean S. Cunningham, Friday the 13th, spurred a spate of sequels and imitators, launching an entirely new genre, the American slasher film. Unlike its most immediate influence, Halloween, where emphasis was placed on spine-tingling suspense punctuated by scenes of violence, here the body count was everything and audiences flocked to witness the mayhem. However, by 1984, interest in the genre seemed to be fading, only to be reinvigorated by a certain resident of Elm Street, but that's another show. And so the executives at Paramount decided to put their disreputable cash cow Jason Voorhees out to pasture. Director Joseph Zito takes the helm, delivering exactly what devotees of the series craved: an attractive cast, ample nudity, decent acting, adequate storyline, hockey masks, and most importantly, lots and lots of brilliantly bloody deaths brought to sanguinary life by makeup wizard Tom Savini, displaying some of his finest work outside of George Romero's Dead series. While admittedly low on realism, the final chapter that wasn't is high on shock value and good jumpy scares. Screenwriter Barney Cohen's able script provides the characters with less than painful dialogue, and the unsuspecting hedonists are up to the task. Among the showcase carnage are impalings by corkscrew, victims thrown from windows, heads crushed in showers, and a nauseatingly vivid machete to the head in the final reel. All goofy, gory stuff, done with a sense of style and skill. Tonight, we celebrate Friday the 13th, the final chapter, 40 years later. A fitting send-off that could have been a satisfying omega to the series, if it hadn't ended up making oodles of money, leading Paramount to revive the series the very next year. But, again, that's another story. Happy Friday the 13th, everybody. We're going to be talking about one of the most beloved installments and one of the most beloved franchises, Friday the 13th, the final chapter. I've got an awesome panel to chat about with me. Let's bring everybody in, and let's say hello to Dave Kasanke.
Hello, everyone.
Lawrence P. Raffle.
Hello.
Fraser Coffeen.
Hi there, everyone.
Larry Sternshine.
Hey, good to be here.
And making her Horror 101 debut, Jessalyn Abbott.
Hi.
And we are here to chat about Friday the 13th, the final chapter from 1984, celebrating its 40th anniversary. And I'm sure along the way, we will chat about some other Friday the 13ths. Thanks for coming on the show, buddy, and welcome. As we usually do, we talk about our origin stories. I'm going to actually bounce down to Jessalyn because this was the first time you had seen this movie, first time you'd seen a Friday the 13th movie, but I think you caught up with some of the others prior to this. So kind of tell us your entryway into the Friday the 13th universe.
Wow. So I always avoided watching them because I had this concept that he was like a water creature and I have like an issue with water. So I just was like, no, thanks. And then obviously that was a rude awakening. And I watched Jason X first, which I really, really enjoyed. And then I went back and watched the first four, which completely different vibes than Jason X. So It was illuminating. But yeah, it was my first. I really did enjoy the fourth one better than 1, 2, and 3, honestly. But we'll get into that.
Yes, we will. Yes, we will. Dave, how about you? What was your first Friday the 13th? And then kind of like, what was your experience with the final chapter?
I had seen the original Friday the 13th. If memory serves, it was probably 1981. I saw it on, if anyone remembers this, I don't remember if it was something that was statewide or Midwest, I don't know, but it was called Select TV, which was like another offshoot of like an HBO or Showtime, things of that nature. And they had showed the original Friday 13th because I think back then you had to wait a long time, well, like a year almost for, a theatrical run to play on cable TV. So I saw it, I was 10 years old, and it was like the first time where I had to question my sanity, where I was like, should I be watching this? I mean, this is not Godzilla. This is not King Kong. This was like a different kind of horror. So it took me a while to like run it through my head. I'm like, is this okay? But then after that, I kind of got into it, and I was like, all right, this is kind of like more of what's current in the early 80s. And then this was the issue of Fangoria that was the actual second issue that I ever bought on the newsstands, which covered Friday the 13th Part 4. Now, at the time, I hadn't seen Part 2. I hadn't seen Part 3. So I was reading about Part 4, and I had to wait maybe like another year before seeing those on cable. The USA Network famously had a marathon back in the 80s where they showed, and I can't remember which ones it was, if it was maybe the first 4. Of course, they were, censored and edited, all the good stuff was missing, but I was able to catch up. And then finally I saw Part 4. And again, this must have been like HBO or Showtime. One of those finally had it probably in 1985 or whatever. And that's how I was able to first see it.
Cool. How about you, Lawrence?
So I feel like this is an easier question to answer.
I was going to say, Lawrence, like, what are you doing here? Like, this isn't an Italian movie. What's going on?
We're talking about like Della Morte, or Zombie. I was probably about 13 or 14 years old when I started to get into horror movies. And, I honestly don't remember specifically the first time that I watched it. It would have been a rental, like from a local video store, like a West Coast Video or an Errol's Video. And I was probably at the time, at that age, just devouring as much as I could within the genre. So I would go down like for each series and just kind of like rent each movie from the series. Because at that time, I was too young to see those movies in movie theaters. But my parents let me rent whatever I wanted, and it was probably just a rental where I just kind of like went down and just devoured the entire series as they came out and they were released on home video, until I think the first Friday the 13th I saw in theaters was Part 6. So yeah, would have been a rental. Just kid whose parents let them rent whatever they wanted and watch whatever they wanted, and that was it. Yeah.
Cool. Fraser.
I shared on the Frankenstein episode that growing up, my dad had like 600 movies at home that he had recorded off of like Cinemax and HBO and everything, Showtime and everything like that, with a hard card catalog system. It was a whole thing, and it was a lot. And amongst those 600 movies were Friday the 13th parts 4 through 8. So I saw this one a ton as a kid, and for me, this was kind of, I wanted to watch them in order, but I just didn't have 1, 2, and 3. So this kind of was my part 1. For years and years, the only evidence I had that 1, 2, and 3 existed were the opening 5 minutes of this.
Yep.
That was all I saw of it for quite a long time. So this was kind of my staple and my entry point into the series, and I watched it. I watched it a lot.
Cool, Larry.
Yeah, I was thinking about this question yesterday because I knew it would be brought up, and my earliest memory with Friday the 13th is with Part 5. I saw it on TV. I didn't realize it was a Friday the 13th movie, but there's a couple of kills that scared me a lot. And I just remember being like, I had to watch like a comedy special or something just to kind of get my mind off of how terrifying this stuff was. And then like the next year or so, when I started getting into more horror, it was the horror comedy stuff that kind of helped me with my fears of the genre. So like Evil Dead 2, for example, would be one that allowed me to face my fears. And then Part 6 was out, and there's a lot of humor in that one. So I loved 6. And then because I liked those, I just sort of watched them all as they would be on TV. I think we recorded some. I had some VHS tapes of my parents recorded. And it's weird too, because growing up, I was a big Nightmare fan, and somewhere along the way, but it switched, and now I just prefer Friday the 13th, and I watch them all the time, and I've got figures and posters and good stuff. So, yeah, it's always just been sort of in my DNA, I guess.
Cool. Yeah, I saw in 1982, I saw a triple feature of the first 1, 2, and 3 Friday the 13th as a triple bill, but Friday the 13th. Final chapter was the first one I saw in a hardtop, and it really delivered for me. It was, it was scary. It made me jump. There were naked women running around. I was like, wow, what a movie. And up until that point, I just continued to watch them, as they came out until we got to Part 8. And I think, just the title alone, I was like, I don't need to see Jason take Manhattan. I'm good. But I've later caught up with it, on video. And, I like you, Larry, I have a great affection for this series because It's kind of big, dumb, fun, horror. And it's very kind of indicative of what was happening in the 80s. Special effects artists were becoming the stars. They were becoming the reason to come and see the show. It's like, oh, Tom Savini's working on this. I know it's going to be worthwhile. Stan Winston's working on this. I know it's going to be worthwhile. Not just the fact that it's celebrating its 40th anniversary, but I feel like Final Chapter is kind of this perfect distillation of what Friday the 13th series is. It's the one I tend to, like you, Fraser, it's the one I tend to introduce people to. I'm like, okay, you'll get caught up in the first, 5 minutes here, and then we'll dive right in. You'll have a fun Jason adventure. I'm curious to hear what other people's thoughts are about Final Chapter and where does it fall in terms of your personal favorites of the series. Larry, let's go ahead and kick things off with you in that regard.
The thing about the Friday movies is 6 will always be my favorite, and then they just sort of change places as I grow older and watch different ones and whatnot. And I recognize that 4 is definitely on the top end of things, because usually there's 6 people and 4 people, and then there's just scatter of the other people have their favorites. I've kind of grown to really enjoy 2 a lot, for example. So I don't watch 4 as much as I used to, but I watched it last night, and it was a very strange experience because I'm noticing all sorts of weird stuff in that movie that we could talk about more later on, but I'm fascinated about that movie again.
I look forward to chatting about the weird stuff because there's some weird stuff in here. Lawrence, how about you?
So I've always liked 4, 6, and I know this is probably unpopular with 7. But 4 primarily because when I was that age, I was Tommy Jarvis in a sense. I didn't make masks, but I kind of dabbled in special effects. I'd buy little bottles of liquid latex and fake blood and do little scars and gashes and stuff. And I would try to make little creatures, but I was never really a very artistic person, so I wasn't very good at it. But I just liked horror and the things that looked like horror, like monsters and stuff like that. So I kind of was able to identify with him at a younger age. I think that's one of the reasons why I like the movie so much. But it is one of the more solid Friday the 13th movies. Solid performances for Friday the 13th movie. Solid writing. And it was always one of my favorite of the series because it really did tap into each of the things that makes these movies so great. The Tom Savini special effects, a good-looking sort of Jason underneath the mask, all that stuff together kind of worked really well. So I always kind of gravitated towards 4. And then over the years, I started to enjoy 5 more than I did when I was younger. I think when I was younger, I kind of fell into that trap of oh, it's a ripoff because it's not really Jason. But, spoiler alert. But over the years, I've grown to appreciate that one even more. And then kind of after the 7th one, I kind of trailed off. So, Manhattan and It Goes to Hell and all that other stuff. I never really was couldn't really get into the ones after that. But 4 was always my go-to.
And Jessalyn, you mentioned in your introduction that 4 ended up being kind of your favorite of the ones you've seen. Perhaps Jason X is rivaling it in terms of entertainment. But coming to these for the first time, what was your thoughts about going through 1, 2, 3, 4?
So I think I don't have the nostalgia servicing me, unfortunately. So I have a lot of concepts of homages in films that I've seen, or I was oh, they them. Now I understand why Kevin Bacon's in this movie. That sort of a thing was really illuminating to me. And the same as I think Larry had said earlier, I came to horror and with comedy and enjoying camp more. And so that's why I think Jason X was a good start for me. And then the first 3, I feel almost I think it was cool that you got to see them all at once because they have the same sort of beats that you can kind of have an idea of where it's going to go, that there's going to be a reveal at a certain time, and that people are going to go off and separate, and then they're going to get killed to a point where they kind of mush together, all 3 of them for me. And I think obviously if you watch them more, it's going to feel separate. And if you don't watch them at the same week, they're going to feel separate. But that's why I was so excited when I started 4 and they had a family. So it was there's a family here, and there's also the kids are still there. So we're still keeping the thing that we're used to. And they have the little fun nurse thing. So I really enjoyed that. And I also just think Corey was so fantastic that he's just so watchable in that film. That kept me, I just want to know what happened to him the whole time. So if you have one character you're really enjoying, whereas I felt like a lot of the characters in the first three were just bodies. I didn't really mind watching them die. I was like, I don't want this kid to get hurt. Like, what are we going to do here? So I think that was one of the things that made me really enjoy that one more.
No, that's a great observation. Yeah, I mean, we have some stronger characters here, and there actually feels like there's some connections. They're not just, camp counselors pairing off. We actually have an investment here.
Yeah.
Dave, how about you?
I'm going to piggyback on those points you guys made, because I think this kind of like ties in with my perspective on it. Is it's like the first three films definitely do tie together, and Jesselyn, your point was definitely on cue. I see it with like the filmmakers, because it's the Cunningham minor, those guys that kind of had worked together and they had a relationship going. You can kind of see the first three kind of tie into each other because of the behind the scenes thing. Then when you see part 4, and then they bring Joseph Zito in, who's kind of like an outsider to this like mentality that was very tight knit up to that point, and he brings what I guess I would call a professionalism more so than the first three probably had. And I think that, to me, watching part 4 so many times over the years, is what elevates it probably a couple notches over the first three, is especially that opening scene, which it took me a while to really even like figure this out, that that's all done in one shot, which is like absolutely incredible when you think about something like that, tying it into a Friday the 13th film is like, well, how did that happen? But again, that is a testament to the director and how he was able to like elevate, which again, by and large, is a pretty routine story. There's really not a lot going on that's different. However, like you said, the location, the hospital is a nice touch. And there is an attempt definitely to make the characters more stronger and give them more personality than just, get them in there lined up and hack to kill and, next, it's not quite just like that. So I've always found part 4 to be definitely head and shoulders above, especially in the technical aspect, way more than the first three were.
Cool. Would you say it's your favorite of the series?
I probably would. And again, I would have to say overall from watching it, like everyone, there's certain parts of all the sequels that we like more than the others. But I would say from start to finish, yeah, it's probably the most solid, best done effort out of all of them, for sure.
Fraser.
Yeah, I agree. I think it was my favorite for a while, and then I kind of leaned a little more towards 6, but I'm firmly back in the 4 camp at this point. Building off of something that we've been talking about here, one of the things that I think is so great about it, and I was really struck by this particular viewing and I loved, is it's sort of this kind of transition point from a sort of more like early 80s kind of slasher, which I think the first 3 are very into, where it's very serious, right? And there's, Jesselyn, you used that word camp, right? There's not a lot of camp, not a lot of humor and like joy in the first 3. I still love them, but they're pretty deadly serious. And I feel like that was pretty common in that earlier 80s style, like more serious. There was like the whodunit aspect that we have in the first one, that was kind of what made up the slasher. And then once we get later into the 80s, we get into a little more campiness, and we get Jason Takes Manhattan. And I don't mean this just for this franchise. This franchise is a good summary of it, but just slashers as a whole. You start to get into like the paranormal aspect that you get with starting in part 6, and this one to me is a great kind of pivot point where it's keeping that kind of seriousness of the first one, but then it's also like, yeah, but we're going to cast Crispin Glover. So we're going to just sprinkle in the camp and sprinkle in the fun and have like the twins. And like, it's heading in that direction without going all the way, over the edge, which I really, really like.
And we also see here, Jason's starting to become the unkillable killer. He comes back basically from the dead. That they presumably have taken his pulse at that barn before they throw him on the gurney and slap him in the ambulance. So presumably he's dead, and somehow he comes back. And then because a lot of people talk about, like zombie Jason starting with 6 and moving forward, because he literally comes back from the dead with the lightning bolt. But that's already kind of present here. And I think that's another reason why I say this is kind of a great distillation of the Friday the 13th franchise, because we have the unkillable Jason. We finally have the hockey mask in place. We have a bunch of young nubile adults who are willing to have sex and get killed. Like there's just a lot of great elements. But then you also have, the character of Rob, who comes in because he's looking for his sister. So you have kind of like a Jason Hunter. I just feel like there's a lot of elements that get incorporated in this one that as you said, Dave, kind of like kick it up a notch.
I agree. And I think, though, that there's some other points, again, for me having devoured a lot of this stuff, especially being a huge fan of like slasher films, I see a lot of parallels. Like, for example, one thing that I really picked up on watching it this time, that it's funny because they don't really, Joe Zito or none of these interviews that I've read really pick up on it, but it seems pretty obvious for me watching it now, is how they almost riff on part 2 to the end. Instead of Amy Steele's character doing the psycho thing about, Jason's mom, and here it's Corey Feldman doing the exact same thing.
Right.
But the thing that always strikes me, though, about this is like it doesn't really make a lot of sense, because why would a 10-year-old boy go through all this trouble to do all this, cutting off his hair and playing Jason, because nothing prior to that led you to believe like, well, he's clearly deranged, he's a psychopath.
Right.
Like where did that come from? And then you see it towards the end when Kimberly Beck is in the hospital bed and the doctor says something, oh, that was normal for him to act like. It's like, no, it's not. It's not normal. He's clearly deranged. And it's just like, whoa, where did this come from? So I mean, there's aspects of the script where they kind of go back to part 2, but that's one part of the film that's always kind of baffled me, because I'm like, are you guys saying that because he's into horror films that he's going to be a killer? I mean, what?
Yes,
what is
yes,
going on
they
here?
are exactly right.
What are we doing here? It almost seems like nobody seems to talk about that. But I'm like, me watching it, I'm like, that's kind of almost what you're inferring, because there's nothing else in his character that would lead me to believe like he's going to transition to this and become like the next Jason after that. I just don't get it.
Something Fraser said earlier, the idea of like, this kind of like being the one that's it's toward the early end of the cycle, of the slashers. Like the early 80s were really when the slasher boom was in full bloom, inspired by Halloween and the success of Friday the 13th. Basically any independent filmmaker could put a guy in a mask and put a knife in his hand and you had a movie. And so we had just a glut of them from 81, 82, and then 84, things are starting to die off, which is why Paramount was like, okay, finally we can, rid our hands of this despicable franchise that keeps making us all this money. And they were going to do the final chapter. Interesting, of course, that Nightmare on Elm Street comes out the same year. And they're like, well, wait a minute. I guess we can't kill off Jason because we got to compete with New Line now. But that notion of it being kind of the ebb, and I think that's why they were able to get Tom Savini back, is because it was going to be the final chapter. He wanted to go out with a big hoorah. Plus, Joe Zito had worked with Savini on his film, The Prowler. Let's talk about Savini's effects in this one, because he does kick things up a notch from his first one, 1980. He'd been doing, he kind of become a rock star after Dawn of the Dead and Friday the 13th, and was now like a household name, at least in certain households.
I have to say, I watched the special features last night on the box that I bought, and they do have a bunch of like behind the scenes footage of a lot of the effects they did. It's just amazing the stuff that he is able to do, especially early on when he turns the coroner's head around. It's like they had to do that in a couple of different ways, and it's really interesting to see how they create a prosthetic for like the twisted neck, but it's his head obviously around it. I don't think there's been anything like that beforehand that I can recall that had a very similar effect. Just the fact that in a sequel to a franchise, they're going to, at the end, to come up with something new is very impressive.
Yeah, that's the thing that struck me, is the idea of something new. And, the effects are great, but what makes the effects great is that like every single one of the kills has something unique and interesting and cool going on with it, right? Whether it's the corkscrew into the hand, or the sort of brutality of Jason pushing in the guy's face in the shower is just so brutal. or even just the
blade
machete through Jason's own hand, towards the end. There's just something kind of special about like every single one of them. I even love the simplicity of when Teddy gets killed on the screen and he goes down and the blood like kind of drips down behind him on the screen. It's all really well thought out, and really each one has some sort of moment of like, I want people to remember this. And the effects are great, but they also serve the idea. They're not just the effect in and of itself.
I think it was key that they did bring Savini back, because I thought that there was a couple things in part 2 and 3 that were lacking. One, I don't think the effects were up to par, but I think also they were so edited and so censored that they almost became subliminal. So I think that bringing Savini back, and because especially by that point in time, 84, he had a bigger name, it seemed to me like the studio was a little more lenient with what they were showing, especially in regards to Jason's death itself was like extremely graphic.
Yeah.
And the fact that they allowed that to happen, I was like, wow, this is like amazing. Because again, prior to that, they almost were like ashamed of how brutal Savini's effects were in the original. They were kind of like, Paramount's like, we're not going to let this happen. We're just going to like almost like cut it down to nothing. So I think the studio got a little more lenient and said, well, we're literally going to make Jason go out with a bang, for this one. And we're going to show you like every grisly detail that we can. So I was impressed with just how much they were able to like show too, because his effects work is so superior to like what they had done in 2 and 3, in my opinion.
And it's worth noting, like I listened to the audio commentary. Zito says that they really did think this was going to be the last one, that Paramount was done. They didn't want to make anymore. So I think it echoes a lot of what people are talking about, the fact that they really did want to kind of go all out for this and give it everything that they had. So they did it's evident that they put a lot of effort into it as well. But he also talked about some like the issues they had with some of the effects. Like we just talked about, the guy gets his head twisted around in the hospital, and he was kind of saying how like they wanted it to work out a different way, but they couldn't really get the effects to work quite well. So they had to do some editing tricks to kind of make it look like his head was twisted more than it actually was. But still, the effort shows, and I'm glad that they put that effort into it.
I think I would more so say, for me, this, I don't know if you would call this an effect or the stunt, but like the window with the dog jumping through the window stuck with me, and then the girl falling through the window afterwards, just because it's so like scary / silly, which I really enjoy. And then when Rob is in the basement, obviously, is the best part of the entire movie, when he's making eye contact. I'm dying right now. I'm being killed right now, guys. He's doing it right now to me. It's so good. And it's scary. It's also scary. So like, that's when the best of both worlds, when the effect is horrifying and it's believable, but you're also like, okay, this isn't really happening IRL, so it's okay.
I mean, this is the heyday of practical effects. The fact that, I mean, Tom Savini is kind of, he said before, he's part magician, like part of his thing is I want to do as much of it in camera. And so you are actually going, how did he do that? Like, how did he pull that off? Is it a fake machete and a real head, or is it a fake head and a real machete? Like, how are they doing it? And he keeps constantly, you pointed out, Fraser, the variety of things. He's not doing the same thing twice. He is constantly changing up and doing a different thing so that you don't go, oh, that's how he's doing it. And I think to your point, Jesselyn, Joe Zito kind of, he later became kind of an action director with the Missing in Action films with Chuck Norris. Like, there is some incredible stunt work. That shot of the twin, going out the window and landing on top of the car. What an incredible shot that is. It's such a great visual.
I forget her name, but Tommy's sister, the one you referenced, where she
Trish.
goes out the window. Yeah. That stunt, was struck this time by the fact that stunt person comes very close to getting smashed in the face by a big stick of wood. And
Yep.
I was like, that was close.
I always remember it just lands right next to her, and I'm like, wow.
I just looked up to who did the stunt coordinating, and it's a guy who's done tons of stunts for like Die Hard and all sorts of like action movies. And they really used him because they threw people out of that window a lot. They did 2 people and a dog.
Well, speaking of stunts, it's a good time to mention Ted White, who plays Jason here. And he is one of my favorite actors to play the role. because I think he brings a lot of physicality to it. But he was a veteran stunt man. He doubled, Clark Gable. He doubled John Wayne. So he'd been around for a long time. There apparently was some tension on set with him and Joseph Zito. There's the famous scene of what's her name, Samantha in the raft. And that was a very cold night, apparently. And she was laying naked in that raft for basically the entire night while they were working to get that shot. And to the point where she almost got hypothermia. Ed White was advocating very hard for her. And so there's a lot of tension on set while they were trying to get what they wanted while trying to keep their actors safe as well.
I think there was also an interesting little bit of a concern too with how they were portraying Jason, because Ted White wanted to, and Joseph Zito also agreed that they wanted him to move fast. Mm-hmm. And the story was that Paramount was like, no, we want him to move slow. We want him to be like the Frankenstein monster. So there was a little bit of tension there too as to how he moved. But again, for me, seeing it the way Ted ended up portraying him with, aggression and with actually running, I have no problem with it. I think it's fine. I think it works well because it just seems more, to use the word realistic, if you want to apply that here. But nonetheless, it seems to make more sense, at least to me.
Yeah. I mean, Kane Hodder, of course, would come on in 6 and he would make the role kind of his own. But I tend to lean toward Ted's incarnation. Also, the fact that in the timeline of this, from 2, it's the next day for 3, and it's the next day for 4. So this all takes place over the course of 4 or 5 days, from 2 to 4.
I mean, it makes sense that he would run because in part 2, Sack Jason is a lot quicker. He's running in that particular one. There is a precedent set here for him to have that little bit more speed, which is good because what I noticed last night is Jason tends to be in the different spots at the same time. And so the editing is a little wonky, but since you've already established that he's a pretty quick dude, maybe he can't go from upstairs to the basement in no time or whatever. You know what I mean?
It's something, if you don't think about it, kind of like a good magician where, if you keep me distracted and engaged, I'm not going to be thinking now, wait a minute, how did that happen? I mean, the fact that he goes around like decorating the house with various victims and tacking people up on the wall, like how did that not make any noise while he's like hammering Crispin Glover up in the doorway? I'm like, nobody hears that.
I do like that those dead bodies act as a force field where she has to jump out another window.
I do love the image of Jason, like, and it's true in other, Michael Myers does this too. I love the image of them like doing that, the thought of them being like, let me pick this one up and put it over here and hammer it into the wall. Like it's so
clean this blood out of here.
Yeah, it's great. It's very satisfying. But one of the things I like this incarnation of Jason quite a bit as well. And I think one of the things that Zito does here that's very different from a lot of the other folks is until the end, he's quite sparing with Jason. We don't see like a lot of the kills. You only get like his hand or like a bit of his head or like or like his gross nails. His nails are disgusting. But you only get like little bits until kind of the final climax, which not entirely. There's some moments you see him like throw her out the window. You see his whole body there, but the shots of like full on head to toe Jason they're few and far between, which I like.
Jesselyn, having just watched the first 4 in sequence, did you notice the morphing appearance of Jason from 2 to 3 to 4?
I was so confused for a minute. Like I needed to take a break for a second and think, well, first I was like, is he 10? And now he's an adult man. And then I realized, oh, no, it was a flash. It was like a moment of flash of like her mind making that up for her. And then he's old and the rest of them, he's older. And then his outfit keeps changing. And I was like, oh, he's got like a wardrobe in the back or something. But I mean, now that I know that, like, I know that he's the hockey mask is like his main one, like, and that came from 4, then from all on
from 3,
out,
yeah.
it's that 3.
Yeah.
Then it like makes more sense to me. It's like they're trying to figure out the character this entire time, and now they know what works for him. But as for the speed thing, did not even occur to me. I think I always assumed his slowness was an intimidation tactic. It wasn't like out of a necessity. So when he was getting faster, it was just because he needed to get to them and they were running away. And that's even more terrifying, in my opinion, is if someone's like, I got you cornered, like I'm going to come at you as fast as I want or as slow as I want. And as an audience member, I'm sure that makes it more of a,
Yeah.
you know,
He comes through the window at the end of 2 and he's got like the long hair. And then the next day, apparently he decided he was just going to shave that off. You know, this hair is too much trouble.
I was like, okay, do you get a little haircut, change your outfit, put a different mask on. He's got a life we don't know about, guys.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, in 3, they do talk about like why he gets new clothes, because he changed out of his overalls and, you know, gets his traditional, you know, gray shirt and jeans. I figure like by 4, they really have it nailed down as to this is the Jason we want. Lawrence, you said you liked 7. Again, we kind of have found our template at that point. I also am a fan of 7. I like 7 actually more than 6 because they kind of come back to that less campy version. But what is it about 7 that appeals, and does it kind of tie into final chapter?
I think one of the reasons I like 7 is why a lot of people don't like 7. I like the telekinesis thing. I know a lot of people don't like that, but it felt like it was just something different. At the time when I first saw it, I had a crush on Laura Park Lincoln, so that didn't hurt either. I also think that, you know, it's probably the best looking Jason.
Yeah.
His makeup is incredible in 7. For some reason, I just think that in that movie, he really kind of like is in his best moment, to be honest. Just between, you know, some of the other effects in the movie, and all kind of just ties together for me. So it's really just, you know, it was John Carl Buechler, right?
Right.
And I just think that the effects were just, you know, the Jason effects, the Jason makeup, and the mask, especially too. At that point, it's been so worn down. But you know, I like 6 because I like how it's kind of like Frankenstein. How he's kind of like, you know, one could argue that in part 4 he's practically a zombie at that point. So I guess you could argue about like, how does he move? Does he move like a zombie? Does he move like a real man? Someone who's alive. So I mean, I think like 4 is really like the first sort of indication that he's maybe not a real person at that point. But yeah, I mean, I just think that 7, because of the effects, the makeup, I think that was really, for me, one of the best versions of Jason in the series.
Going back to final chapter, we also have a lot of nudity, gratuitous, for this one. I think this was the most gore and most nudity we had in a Friday the 13th film. But again, that's kind of like, that's what the people are coming for, is that it's what the expectations were. And I feel like they're just trying to check every single box.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because this is one of the points I wanted to bring up, is how the general perception of these films were seen back in the day. Because again, I remember I was reading all the magazines, I was watching the TV stuff, I was devouring whatever I could, and I was very interested. One of the reasons why I became so interested in slashers were because they were deemed the worst of the worst. It was what I call LCD. They were the lowest common denominator of the horror film. And if you like them, you were like a horrible person. So I'm like, all right, I'm a horrible person. All right. So what I did is I went back and I rewatched the Siskel and Ebert sneak previews. Now, for those who don't know, whether it's this panel or anyone watching at home, they were essentially 2 film critics who had their own weekly show on TV. And they were pretty much the go-to for like highbrow film criticism. So your average person was like, oh, let's see what Siskel and Ebert had to say about, you know, these films. And those guys hated slasher films, and that's putting it mildly. So I got some quotes from their episode on the final chapter. Roger Ebert said, and I quote, "It's a moral and reprehensible piece of trash. Sad, cynical, depressing movie. The people who made this movie ought to be ashamed of themselves." Gene Siskel went on to say, "The film is literally about stabbing. Watching girls getting stuck is entertainment. That's the pornography." So that's essentially where those guys were coming from. And for the longest time, that was the general perception that these films had. And one of the issues that I take with that is that they always pinpointed this stuff as being misogynistic, saying that the women, the characters of the women were the ones that were treated like the worst. And I can sit there and I can go back and like look and I took some notes and I'm like, they list 13 murders in part 4. Now 6 of them are the male characters. We have Axel, who gets with a hacksaw. Paul is speared. Jimmy has a corkscrew and a cleaver. Ted is knifed. Doug has his nose jammed into his skull. Rob has a garden harrow and neck. And then, of course, there's Jason. So it's 50-50. There's clearly a split between genders here. So how is that the women seem to be treated worse than the men? And it seems like everybody who's a critic seems to overlook that men get killed too. And they're not getting killed in like just, simple, nice ways. They're brutal too. Yeah. But it just seems like that always is overshadowed. That always bothers me how critics of this stuff just seem to pinpoint that, and it gets labeled that way. And then your average person is like, oh, those films are all misogynistic. They treat women horribly. And I'm like, do you not watch these films? It's 50-50. It's split half and half. But again, I just had to like throw that out there.
No, I'm glad you did.
It always bothered me.
Yeah. Well, like we mentioned earlier, I mean, one of the male characters who's being killed is yelling, "He's killing me! He's killing me!" It's the least graphic kill in the movie, probably, and it's the most horrifying to watch because you hear him dying, and it's really horrifying.
Yeah, and he's our hero. He's the thing. If anybody's going to be able to take Jason on, it's that guy, and he is no match for Jason at all. I'm glad you brought that up, Dave, because here we all are. We all wanted to talk about this movie. We all like talking about these movies. And like, what is it that is fun about these movies? What is it that keeps us coming back and enjoying them when it is about, watching people get murdered? And like, that's basically what these movies are. I mean, Siskel's not wrong. That's what the movies are. At the same time, I think there is some fun to be found in it. And I'm curious to hear if anybody has any theories about what it is that's enjoyable.
Well, I think ignoring that things like this happen, not like there's a slasher out there, but people get killed, and we pretend that things like don't happen in real life, and we don't let ourselves like expose ourselves in the smallest ways to that is like kind of a disservice to humanity in general. It lets you just like be like, yeah, people are weird. Humans are strange, and strange things happen, and let's laugh at it, but let's also like talk that this like people like there are mass murderers out there, like that's a real thing. And I think the same with like, oh, don't play GTA, it's going to make you steal cars. It's just like, no, this is just life. We're having a fun time enjoying reality in a safe setting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's kind of like a vicarious
not to change the subject back, but I want to go back to the sexist thing real quick, because I totally agree with you, and I don't think sexism and like feminism only has to do with kills. I think it's character development, and I think the women characters in 4 are way more developed than the male characters. So if anything, it's kind of playing like a super equal playing field. And like the one character, his entire like storyline is like, I'm not a good enough lay. I'm not a good enough lay. What a sad just male character that has no depth to him. So I just disagree with that completely, and I agree with what you were saying. Like it's a 50-50 situation. They're all just in this problem together. Anyway, go on.
No, thank you. That was great. But thoughts about, kind of like what it is about these films that is enjoyable. Why do we, because we're all good people. I know all of you, and I would like, I would hang out with any of you. It's not because you're these scary, dark people. So what is it that we can enjoy about these movies?
What makes a movie rewatchable, especially a lot of these, is it's not so much about like, I'm rooting for Jason, is I like the characters and I enjoy spending time with them, what little time I have. Like for this one, for example, Jimmy, Crispin Glover's character, he's so much fun to watch because he has that wacky dance and it's very memorable and you kind of want to watch that a bunch of times. He has an actual arc. Sure, it's an arc about having sex, but he gets the confidence and he's apparently he's good in the bed and he's happy. And then he dies. But like you get an arc. A lot of these characters, you get an arc before they die. Sasha, you don't go back to as one you like. Everyone's obnoxious.
You just don't care.
You don't care, and you're just not going to go back to them. And that's what makes the great Friday the 13th movie so wonderful, is the characters and all the moments they give them.
This group comes across as friends in a way that a lot of times they don't. There's a lot of little interactions between the characters that are really that are really kind of nice, of like establishing like, oh, these are people who hang out together and like have a good relationship. And I agree, Larry, that because of that, we enjoy spending time with them. And like, yeah, fine, it ends with them being killed, but like that's not real life. I'm not hung up. Like, I don't think that anything bad happened to Crispin Glover. Like I got to watch his character for a while, and then this is what happened at the end of my time watching his character. But that doesn't.
This magic trick happened at the end.
Yeah, and that's totally fine. The other thing that I'll put out there, maybe for those of us, like all of us on this panel, who who watch a lot of these kinds of things, for me, one of the things that I find a great joy in and really find exciting is watching like the execution of this genre, right? There are these things that you expect from a genre and sort of seeing the ways that like they execute it well. And then sometimes they kind of subvert it a little bit, or they do something a little different. That's what I find really fun about really diving into like slashers, and being like, and just seeing that, well, here's a really cool way that they delivered on what I expect to come here, or where they didn't quite deliver on it, but I love how they did it instead. That there's a lot of fun in that, of sort of dissecting it and feeling it. And I'm not really like in my head the whole time I'm watching it. It's just that those moments come and I appreciate them. And I'm like, yeah, that's, you got me on that one, because I didn't expect that to happen. And that's cool.
The polish behind Final Chapter is different than, say Final Exam. We're not sitting here talking about Final Exam, another cheapo slasher. This is kind of run of the mill. Like we're actually, it's really, I love that you brought that up, Fraser, because it is about the execution of it. It is the setup and it's the delivery. And this film manages to do that time and time again.
Yeah, I agree too about like the portrayal of the female characters, because like for me personally, as far as like Final Girls, Kimberly Beck is probably my absolute favorite out of like the entire series. I think her character is absolutely fantastic. She doesn't come across as like oh, I'm like like a Ripley character, but she doesn't come across as like meek and mild either. She's kind of like a nice balance there, which to me is very realistic, and it doesn't bother me at all. She seems like well equipped to handle whatever. I mean, her portrayal is like fantastic. I think she's definitely the best part of the film as far as characters go. So yeah, testament to her for sure that she's like hands down to me the best character for sure. And so again, that people tend to overlook that aspect of it as well. It's just like people seem to sometimes forget, the original killer was Mrs. Voorhees, not a guy, but that seems to like just go out the window with some people too. It's just like, come on, give credit where credit's due. There's a lot of good female characters in here too. So let's definitely bring that to the front, because it's worth celebrating as well.
Well, and I'm glad you just mentioned that, because, this is a franchise that had different screenwriters for every single installment up until this point. Like things started off with Victor Miller with Friday the 13th, but then we had Ron Kurz, who came on for 2 and kind of brought Jason to the front. And then we had Martin Kitrosser and Carol Watson for part 3. And then here we have Barney Cohen, who was brought in because they wanted Joseph Zito to write and direct. And Joseph Zito's like, I'm not a writer. And they're like, no, we really want you to write and direct. So he's like, calls his buddy Barney Cohen, who pulls it all together and goes, okay, how's this for a Friday the 13th movie? But like the fact that we have a growing mythology, and that's one of the things I like about this series, is that things do continue to just grow and morph, and you can point to the one and go, that's the one where it's not Jason, and that's the one with the telekinetic, girl, and that's the one where he goes to Manhattan, but really on a boat most of the time. Like each one of these kind of has its own distinct flavor, and I think that's what makes it fun.
I just wanted to say, like, I think that speaking about this just being a movie about stabbing is really just taking it at face value. Like, we all know, like, every horror trope or genre has like some historical value behind it. Like vampirism is like people being afraid about the plague, and this is some talk about purity culture, and like there's a lot more depth to why that came out when it did and what they were trying to say or trying to poke fun at, I believe. And I think just saying that, oh, people seeing people being stabbed is the only purpose of this film is like really a surface level look at the situation.
Well, just I can tell you what that is. That's somebody going in with an agenda versus actually watching the film for what it is. They already have their mind made up of what they're going to see and what they're going to talk about. and everything else is irrelevant. That's exactly what that is.
There really was an axe to be ground against these films in the early 80s. Like, it was, if you liked them, as you said, Deb, if you liked them, you were considered the lowest of the low. And now there's like this, here we are 40 years later, and we're talking with great nostalgia. I mean, like, these are part of our pop culture now. Like, everybody knows who Jason is. He's the guy with the mask, and you go to conventions and people have, the kids dressed up as, Freddy with a glove, and their 2-year-old has a Jason mask on. This is all just part of the culture now.
What you were saying before about the different screenwriters and the way the mythology goes, and yeah, each one has its own flavor, and I agree with that. But one of the things that I really like about this particular series, we were talking before about different franchises. This is, depending on the day you catch me, I might say this is my number one favorite horror franchise. I love it. And one of the things is that, yes, they each have their own flavor, but I love that they're always connected back. I love that this starts right there where 3 ended, and they always do that, right? There's always this like tie back to like, well, we left Jason tied up with a chain around his neck at the bottom of the lake, so that's where he is. So we're going to have to deal with that. Until, and I think it's very telling that in this whole conversation, we have really, really focused on like 1 through 8 with a brief mention of X, because that's like such a set, because they stop doing that after that, right? There's no connection point between the end of 8 and the beginning of 9. Because it would be really hard to do that, because he's in a very compromised state at the end of 8, and they just sort of throw in the towel, and they're like, nah, we're not going to do that. And I think that's really to the detriment of the series. I know people really dislike 8. I'll take 8 over 9 any day of the week.
I have affection for the New Line entries. I do like Goes to Hell, and I do like Jason X. I like Jason X just because it's like, it knows exactly what it is. And I think Jason Goes to Hell, they're 100% trying to do something else. They're like, you know what? We have had the guy in the mask long enough. Let's do something else. And so I admire that for what it is.
I have a soft spot for Jason Goes to Hell because it was the very first one I saw in theaters. And it was on a trip to Minnesota, and my mom took me. So it's always like a fond memory. And I even bought a magazine around that time that was the history of Friday the 13th. And they have articles about the final girls and all the different Jasons and the kill count and all this stuff. I still have it. I was looking at it yesterday. It was like, I think that's probably why I love this series so much, is that it's just been a part of my growing up. And I still have like all this memorabilia and whatnot. And the other thing I want to point out too, what makes 1 through 8 awesome, in the middle of it, there's a trilogy. There's a Tommy Jarvis trilogy.
Yep.
What other horror franchise has a random trilogy in the middle of it?
Yeah, I was telling my wife, she was like, "Wait, Corey Feldman shows up in." I'm like, "Yep, but he's not Corey Feldman." Tommy Jarvis shows up in 5 and 6. She's like, "Why?" And I'm like, "Well, because what else are you gonna do? We ran Jason's head down the front of a machete. We got to do something else." While 5, I can understand people like going, yeah, but it's not real Jason. I'm kind of like, I'm engaged. I'm fine with you, investing us in Tommy Jarvis for a film, and then going, you know what, we actually need to bring Jason back. And then the ridiculous way in which they do that. And Tommy Jarvis is kind of our final girl throughout 6. I think there's again, some fun to be had. Kind of going back to the New Line. I mean, without Jason Goes to Hell and Jason X, we might not have Freddy versus Jason, which I think is another, fun way to celebrate these 2 slasher icons. So I don't mind the New Line stuff, but I agree, like 1 through 8 kind of is the Paramount canon.
I like X, to be clear.
I guess the quick question then would be, do you guys like the remake? Because I'm always kind of iffy on the remake.
I like it. I'm a big fan.
Not a huge fan, but I wouldn't throw it in the trash. I would still watch it.
It's from that period where they were doing like all of those things, like, your Hills Have Eyes and your Texas Chainsaw Massacres and like all of those remakes that all kind of had the same sort of sheen to them. None of which I was a huge fan of. I don't hate on them. Not a huge fan. I think I'm in the same boat as Lawrence. Like I'm not exactly going to go back to it, but it's all right.
I think also I just don't have any nostalgia for it. Like, it wasn't you know, it wasn't even close to my first Friday. So like it really is coming at the end of it. And it feels like they're trying to do something. Yeah, you're hitting all the beats. And, you know, Jason grows pot and apparently is a really great tunneler. But aside from that, I'm kind of like, it's, you know, it's fine.
Jason defending his pot farm is weird. It's really weird. It's a weird choice.
I have to watch this. What the heck?
You do have
Yeah,
to.
yeah, that is a major plot point.
Yeah, gotta watch them all. Really.
What?
That's true.
Jesselyn's like, spoiler, what?
Sorry about that.
No, that's amazing. I was not planning on seeing it, so now I'm.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah, he's clearly advocating for legalization. Just
Yep.
in like a much
And
different
look,
way than
they
what you-
legalized it, and you know, I'm just
Yeah.
saying, Jason had a big part
In
that.
Jersey, and they're in Jersey, and I'm a Jersey girl, so
Yep.
get it.
Actually, we should mention the fact that like Friday the 13th final chapter was shot in California as opposed to New Jersey. The first two were shot there. Was the third one shot in New Jersey, or did they bring it to LA for that one?
I think 3 was in LA. I think.
Okay, yeah, I can't remember if they had. I know the first two were up still local.
You know, there's one point. This is just a complete aside to what you're just saying about being shot in California. Is the scene where they're in the car, and they ask Rob. They're like, "Well, what are you here for?" And he goes, "Hunting." And they're like, "What are you hunting?" And he goes, "Bear." And then you see Tommy's is like that you know that there's no bears here. And you know this is me with like useless information. But if it was Jersey, you can look this up. I think the number one population of bears is actually New Jersey. Not that anyone's even paying attention. No one cares. It's completely irrelevant, useless information. However, I'm like, if this was New Jersey, he would definitely be hunting bears. You were talking earlier about the different script writers. And one of the obviously the key main plot point to the final chapter was having a little boy as being like kind of like the protagonist. And Joe Zito made a comment where I don't really believe we've seen, you know, that before. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. A couple years earlier in the movie Nightmare, aka Nightmares in a Damaged Brain, it's almost the exact same plot. If you think about it, you've got a little boy. Also, he's with a single mom, and they're being stalked by this killer. And at the end of the film, the little boy has to take matters into his own hands and defend, you know, the oncoming of a killer. They're portraying that the seed has been passed off to him, and he could be the next killer. And I'm like, wait a minute, that seems a little close to the final chapter.
Yep. Well, and it's at the end of final chapter, you do have that freeze frame that goes, and this could not be the final chapter, by the way. You know, we could keep this going. And well, they did the next year. I'm amazed at how many movies they cranked out from 1980 to 1989. We get all 8 of those movies. That's nearly a movie a year, you know, so there was clearly an audience for it. And it lasted much longer than the slasher boom itself.
And you do wonder with that end shot, you know, your point about the different screenwriters, like, is that them sort of like sprinkling and being like, you take this where you want? You know, do you want Tommy to be, you know, just kind of psychotic? Do you want a Halloween Ends type thing where he's like got some sort of spirit in? Like, it's up to you. Like, I'm just going to sort of put this out there, and whoever picks up the reins after me can do with it what they will.
Well, and I like that they went both directions. They're like, yeah, he's crazy. No, he's not. You know, here's 5, here's 6.
Yeah, it's very it's good improv stuff, right? I'm setting things up, and like you can run with it as you see fit. Knock yourself out.
Let's circle back around. Any final thoughts on Friday the 13th final chapter and the series as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's one of my favorite slasher series, and just to kind of go back to something we were talking about a little bit earlier, this notion that like in the 80s, as popular as these movies were, they were really, you know, considered to be one step away from pornography, basically. And that's one reason why the critics always went after them. And, you know, I don't think you should ever have to like feel bad or feel like a movie is a guilty pleasure. Movies are an escape. And if you like a really good seasoned horror movie, that's good. If you like a good trashy escapist horror movie, that's also good. So, you know, I've spent my whole life answering to people, you know, why do you watch these movies? Why do you like these movies? And I don't really like having to answer that question because, like, why do you go see a comedy? Why do you go see a drama? It's because you want to experience an emotion, you want an escape, and you just want to see something that you don't normally get to see. Or maybe you want to laugh a little, maybe you want to be scared. So I think that's okay. And if it's a good, one of the higher sort of like echelon slasher movies, that's great. If it's a low rent slasher movie or monster movie, that's great too. But I like this movie because it is slightly elevated above some of the other slashers of the time. And I think if you're trying to find like a good example of a really solid 80s slasher movie where they really put everything into it that they had, a decent script, decent characters, decent kills, all across the board, I think that this is definitely the one.
If I can dovetail on that, Lawrence, I think this is a great gateway into slashers. Like this, if you want to get into the slasher pool, this is a great way to get in because it does kind of deliver everything you expect, but it delivers it really well. Fraser.
Like I said, I love it. I think it's such a great movie. And I think there's a craft to it that often gets overlooked. I'm going to circle all the way back to what Dave said at the very beginning about sort of the, Joseph Zito bringing what some of the skills that he brings. My favorite shot of the whole movie, something that we haven't talked about, is at that opening scene with the recap of, at the ending where Friday Part 3 ended, and there's all the helicopter and there's the ambulances and everything like that. And then that all drives away and he lingers on the shot of everything gone and just the woods and that barn. And he stays there for a lot longer than you think he's going to stay there to give this great menace of like, oh, something terrible happened here. And now it's gone and everybody's left. But still, an awful, awful thing took place right here. And that is craft. And that's what the Siskel and Ebert reviews are not willing to see. But it's there.
Larry.
So it's funny. I went into this watching it last night being like, just noticing things. I was like, okay, this is, maybe I don't like it as much. And now I'm talking to you guys. I'm like, oh, I like it again. That's what I like about the series is you can just talk to somebody that bring up a point. And what Fraser is saying is true. These movies all have a craft to them. They don't get the respect they necessarily deserve. They get a lot more now. To have a great character that you like and then you don't want to see them die, that's a craft that not everybody can do. Jason's just really cool. He's just like a cool villain. You can buy so many different figures of him because he has so many different outfits. He's like the Barbie of slashers. It's fantastic. Definitely, I'm glad that we had a chance to talk about it and remember why we love these movies so much.
Dave.
Well, first of all, Fraser, your point about that shot in the darkness is brilliant. I agree with you 100%. I love that. That rules. Larry, to your point, if you would have told me in 1984 that I'd be able to buy a figure of Jason at a local Target, I would have said, you're nuts, you're crazy, it'll never happen. That being said, Friday the 13th series is definitely my all-time favorite of like all the franchises. And my all-time favorite writer, the late great Chaz Balin, dubbed Jason the Sultan of Slaughter. And that's kind of always stuck with me because even though it's the films in its entirety, some are obviously not as good as others, but the character of Jason, I think, has stayed relatively unchanged. They really haven't messed with the character as much as the others. It's kind of like the Big Mac might be the best out of the franchise sandwiches, but I like a Whopper. And the Whopper is pretty cool because that's like Jason. Like they haven't really messed with it. Maybe made the Whopper a little smaller, but nonetheless, it's one of those things where it's like I appreciate that, and I can get into the films way more than the other franchises. So anytime I have to defend any of those, the slashers, it's Jason Voorhees by like a wide margin, hands down.
And Jocelyn.
It's important to give the respect to the fact that it creates a vibe. It has its own energy. And when you go into any of the first four movies, I'm not sure how it goes on from there. You're going to feel a certain feeling. You're going to feel woodsy. You're going to feel a little scared. You're going to feel a little happy. If you want to be in that aura, then you can go back into these movies. And I think the fourth one specifically has really great rewatchability. And that is not something that you can take for granted as especially for a slasher. If you know what's going to happen, that person's going to die this way, this person's going to die that way. The ability to make someone to want to watch it again and re-enter that world and see those characters and be in the cabin, that's really important and really impressive in my opinion. So I'll be watching the rest of them. So that's a big deal for me to want to watch 6 more movies in a franchise,
Thank you. I think what you just touched on there, the rewatchability of it, I think that is a testament to all of these components, all of the artists, from the directors to the writers to the actors to the special effects, is that it doesn't become passe. We're still excited to watch Crispin Glover do his crazy dance, and we're excited to watch Tom Savini work his magic. Nothing feels like it's just happening by rote, with the exception of Mrs. Jarvis kind of being startled in the camera, and you're kind of like, what happens to Mrs. Jarvis? That always kind of bothered me. I'm like, well, I want closure. I want closure on Mrs. Jarvis. I think we eventually get it in 6 or 7, like somebody says, and his mom died as well. I really enjoy this franchise. I enjoy the rewatchability of it. I love all the skill that goes into it. And again, as I've said many times over the course of this hour, I love that this is kind of the perfect distillation of the Friday the 13th. I think it's a great way to kind of like, if somebody wants a Friday the 13th movie, this is a great place to get them into the pool. And if they like it, then they can head in either direction and enjoy even more. Cool. Thank you all so much. This was super fun, and it was going to be. This is a great panel, and I enjoyed hearing all of your insights. And until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep sharing the scare.